that, I'll pass the mic to Carmen Chung. Carmen.
Thank you so much, Lee, and thank you for the pitch and for the incentives. Hi, everyone. I'm Carmen Chung. I am the Executive Director for the Center for Justice and Accountability. It's so wonderful to see friends, new and old, here in this room. For those of you who are not as familiar with our organization, just very quickly, we are an international human rights organization based here in the United States. We use the law and the courts to seek accountability for atrocity. We work with communities around the world who've been impacted by war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, extrajudicial killings, torture, to seek legal redress in US courts and also in courts around the world. So it's been really our pleasure to be working with Lee and his colleagues on our case against the government of Syria, which focuses on the use of torture in Assad's prisons. And for that, we have recognized Freshfields with our Partner in Justice Award for this year. And so thank you so much for that. There's a trophy there for you. And so part of the reason why we're having this party instead of our usual gala is because of the funding crisis that Lee mentioned. So every other year we have an in-person gala in San Francisco where we bring everyone together, our community, to celebrate human rights defenders and all of those who make our work possible. But because of you might have heard about some of the budget cuts to foreign assistance that happened at the beginning of this year. That deeply impacted CJA and its work. And so as a result, we decided to not host our in-person gala and to move to a virtual gala instead. When Freshfields heard about this, they said, well, why don't we just have a party here? Because our amazing champions of justice, who I'm going to introduce to all of you in a bit, are based here in the New York metro area. And we thought that was an incredible idea to bring them together and to be able to celebrate them in person and to also celebrate our partners at Freshfields. So that's why we're all here today. So it's not quite the gala that we normally have, but I am so glad that you're all here. So without any further ado, we have three incredible women with us today. All three are journalists. They are inspirations to us all. The theme of our celebration this year is actually the power of truth. And what these three incredible women have done over their careers is really bring the truth to all of us in so many different ways. Our two champions of justice this year are Deborah Amos and Susan Meiselas. We have a very long citation on our website about why we've given these two incredible women their awards. But Deborah Amos, as many of you might recognize once she starts speaking, has been a longtime foreign correspondent on NPR. She has covered world-changing events, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the fall of the Berlin Wall. We came to know Deb through her work with us and covering a case that we did several years ago involving the targeted assassination of Marie Colvin, who was an acclaimed war correspondent killed by the Assad regime. We represented Marie's family in a case against the government of Syria, and that's how we began to develop a relationship, I guess, with Deb and her work. Deb has won many prizes, among them the Pulitzer and the Peabody Award, and probably many others I have already forgotten. So this is the least of the awards that she has won.
Certainly not. Certainly not.
Deb is currently a professor at Princeton, the journalism school, and we are so delighted to be presenting this award to her today. Susan Meiselas is a legend in war, basically in photography. She has documented human rights and conflict for the last 50 years, for over 5 decades. And she, among her many awards, is the MacArthur Genius Grant. She is currently the president of the Magnum Foundation. We came to know of Susan and her work through all the work that CJA has done on El Salvador. So our organization over its 27-year history has done a lot of work in Latin America, and a fair amount of that work has involved the civil war in El Salvador, which remains really live to this day. In fact, right now there is there are still prosecutions going on in El Salvador relating to the civil war there. And we are at CJA still litigating cases involving the Salvadorian Civil War, including one right now, which involved the targeted assassination of 4 Dutch journalists who were there to report on the human rights situation as a result of the war. And we got to know Susan and her work through that. And it's incredibly powerful work. I encourage you all to go and see it and take a look at it on her website. But she is, I don't know. We told people that we were giving an award to you, Susan, and everyone's like, "How did you get her into that room?" She is just so so incredibly well respected in the field, and we are deeply honored to be able to recognize Deb and Susan for their work.
Yes.
So we've framed today's event as a fireside chat between Susan and Deb and our moderator, Julia Preston, who is also an acclaimed journalist in her own right. She's a longtime foreign correspondent, formerly with the New York Times, also reported with the Washington Post, also a Pulitzer Prize winner, so many prize winners here, and recently with the Marshall Project, and now doing reporting around issues that are very close to home. So it is really our privilege to have Julia hosting this conversation today, and really having all 3 of them here at a moment where I think we are thinking a lot about human rights, the state of the world, near and far, and what truth means, and what we can all do to advance truth in our lives and in our work. So over to you.
All right. Thank you, Carmen. Well, I would start by saying I'm really very pleased to be invited to moderate this discussion with 2 women whose journalism I've admired for many years. And I'm also privileged to say that they're my sisters, my friends. And I also wanted to say that it's good to be in this room at this moment when the rule of law is under such challenge in this country. I write mainly about immigration. And so it has turned out that a Salvadoran immigrant is now at the center of a case where the executive branch is in a frontal challenge with the Supreme Court. And it's satisfying to be in the room with lawyers who understand that when the rule of law is challenged, you have to stand up. And so I'm very grateful to Freshfields as well for sponsoring this event. So Deb, let's start with you. You have been working in recent years to document and report on the war crimes in the barbaric civil war under the Assad regime in Syria. And I'm just wondering, what have you learned about what journalists can do to advance the cause of truth in that kind of situation?
So let me start by saying that, nobody grows up dreaming of being a war correspondent. It just kind of happens. And I started, my first one was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. I've been in Afghanistan. Syria was late in my career. I'd covered it for almost a decade. And it was pretty horrendous under Bashar al-Assad before the uprising. And it became, for many years, torture was known about, but it was a secret. Your uncle would disappear, a nephew would disappear, and you wouldn't really know what happened. During the uprising that began 14 years ago, they wanted you to know. That was the point. And when you would see pictures of people, hanging from poles, you'd think, who took that picture? Oh, I know who took that picture. There's only one person in that room that would have had a camera. And I think many of us who covered that conflict felt that all we could do was storytelling. I always have a difference about truth and storytelling. I think what we do is storytelling. Truth is what you all do. That's about court. What we do is find characters who can be the pack mules, as a journalist I know once said, for the facts. That's our job. And in Syria, I think everybody felt that responsibility, that you had to try some way to talk to people who had been mauled by the system. You could get to the survivors because they were leaving the country. I actually was in the courtroom in Germany when there was the first universal jurisdiction trial for state-sponsored torture in Syria, because the man who was on trial made the mistake of coming to Germany as a refugee, and he was recognized. And Syrians helped push that trial.
When did that take place?
It was in 2022 is when it began, and 2024 I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. And I think for all of us to actually witness accountability when we have been steeped in the age of impunity is a remarkable thing to do as a journalist. You're not supposed to have opinions about these things, but I was very happy to be in that courtroom to see it because I knew what was happening, and I reported as often as I could about what was happening in Syria.
So, Susan, one of the very, very important stories that you told with your camera was the aftermath of the massacre that took place in the village of El Mozote in El Salvador in 1981 at the end of the year. And you told the world about that massacre at the time, and then you've been back to El Salvador. And I know that you are very thoughtful about your images and how they evolve and their presence over time. I'm just wondering, remind us a little bit about the work that you did with relationship to El Mozote, and how do you think about that case in terms of how you engage in truth and accountability through your photographic practice?
You know, I'm actually still thinking about what you just said. And I know this is an important question from Julia, but at the same time, the idea that you could witness accountability. So that's my segue to Mozote.
Right.
Where you could.
Creating what we thought was evidence of the largest massacre in Latin America at the time, maybe even still, and not having the level of accountability that we expected by this time. So I'm going to take you back 44, 45 years ago. I mean, we're looking at this incredible landscape. We're in this very privileged space, you know, and this goes back to practice, how we work. We hear, she's a radio reporter, I'm hearing radio. Ray Bonner, who's a reporter for the New York Times, we're hearing about a massacre. We don't know if a massacre has occurred. We're hearing it from Radio Liberación, embedded in the mountains of northern El Salvador. And the question was, well, did it or didn't happen? Of course, the U.S. Embassy denies that it happened at the time. No other source comes forward. So we, you know, when you think about how do you get where you're going without knowing where it is exactly, that's a lot of what this work involves. You said finding the characters who tell a story. In my case, and in our case, I mean, Ray was the one who told the story, essentially. But what I have as a memory is what it means to hear something and then to plot, okay, how do we get maybe there? And getting there, and this is part of just being willing to face the complete unknown of whether or not you can get there. So we meet from two different points. We meet in Honduras in a camp, a refugee camp in Honduras. We've found somebody who's going to guide us across the border, illegally, by the way. No, we don't need to emphasize that, but we had to cross the border from Honduras to northern El Salvador. We're walking for, I can't even remember, something like 10 or 15 hours behind people we don't know, believing that somewhere, we're going to go somewhere and they are going to lead us to something. And we get to the town or the village of Mozote, and there's nothing, and there's dead silence. So there isn't the person that comes running up to tell you, I've got to tell you what just happened. right? It's completely abandoned. So when I look back at my contact sheets, I see, you know, I have almost nothing that I can photograph that speaks to the enormity of what we've heard about, right? So if you were to see those contact sheets, you know, you see pots that are broken, you see a few bones from bodies that have been burned as the tiles of the houses fall down, scraps of things. And then we come across a cornfield where you actually see that the evangelical church had encouraged people to stay, nothing would happen to them. And there were the bodies, but not 1,000 bodies. A few bodies here in a cornfield, a few bodies there. So as a photographer, you're faced with, you have a sense of the scale of something that's happened like this, but you don't actually have proof. And you all know what it means to have proof. So on one level, you have what you have. It takes another day or so to find the one survivor. And she then recounts what had happened the day before and the days right before, and recounts, and the names. They have the complete list of the names of the villagers because it was their village. They knew exactly who was no longer there. So you use the word disappeared in these isolated ways, and the people who know best are the people who live. I mean, I have that same recollection in Kurdistan many decades later, but that the people who really know exactly who has gone missing. But in this case, the whole village was destroyed. The exhumations didn't begin.
You went back later, right?
And we went back for the 10th anniversary. The exhumations, though, have continued. I went back again 4 or 5 years ago. The exhumations have continued.
Almost, it's 980, it's almost 1,000 people that were
Exactly.
killed. Yeah.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is, where were the bodies? If you can't prove the bodies, it's very difficult to prove the case, right? And so, though they indicted a certain number of people who were associated with the Adelkat Battalion, which some of you know was trained by the U.S. Army, it's a complicated case. They're tracking down through DNA. It's now 44 years. Is the DNA live? Can it be traced to anybody in a specific enough way? So for me, Masote speaks to the challenge that we face when we think we are doing the least we can do, which is to try and witness. That's the first level, you know. Can we prove, and that moves to the next, circles of people, and that's why I think CJA is so crucial, because they continue to work towards that possibility. We as journalists, and me as a photographer, it's important to say, yes, the photographs went to Congress. That has happened again. The Maryknoll nuns, I documented the killing of the Maryknoll nuns. That led to
Does everybody know about the church women?
the 4 Maryknoll nuns. I think, just to reference it slightly, the difference is there that Jimmy Carter, as president, stops the military aid immediately and wants to have a process, puts a process in place. It's a temporary process for the certification of human rights, et cetera. And I'm talking a little in shorthand to you because
you have made a photograph when they dug up the 4 bodies.
John Hoagland, who was working for AP. By the way, I'm working freelance, but I go with John searching for what we've again heard about, right? We hear, and in this case, actually, it's a source that calls the AP office and says, "You guys should check out Santiago Nonualco," which is a particular area of El Salvador, a few hours from the airport. But tracing the entire story, we're reading about now, 2 weeks ago in the New Republic.
Yeah.
It's one version of all the complexity of what happened. What we're trying to do is, at that point, we're trying to find the bodies.
Right.
And we do find the bodies. And Robert White, the ambassador, finds the bodies. And that, finding the bodies, it sounds terrible. I just want to say one other thing associatively about finding bodies. Visibility, what you said about visibility and the terror. So having the disappeared is one level of terror. Who's next? And we may all be feeling a little of that. But the visibility of a body on a road in El Salvador, with very often half eaten by vultures, et cetera, that's another kind of terror. Mm-hmm. And that was really something I'd never ever imagined before.
But that was an explicit form of terror in El
Exactly.
Salvador.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
They were very
So-
public. They used the corpses to
Absolutely.
display, to
Yeah.
to make a public statement. So, I mean, this is interesting. So we have an audio reporter, photographer, I'm a writer. So, I mean, how does your particular media, do you think, influence the way you tell a story about something like this, about war crimes, about this?
I hate to say this with Susan sitting next to me, but audio is very visual.
Oh, I know that.
You know,
Oh,
I love
absolutely.
audio.
yeah, and you think about that. You know, you sort of write in haiku, and then promote the tape. You pick the best, most almost always emotional, and then you write below it, so that people will you set it up so that people can understand it, because you have to. It all has to be short. You know, even if you've got 6 minutes, it's never enough. And so that's what you're looking for. Can I record something that you can see when you hear it on the radio? That it's visual, and that takes some work to do.
And especially in a situation where you're talking about crimes that took place in Syria, you can't go there.
No, you can't. But those stories were a bit easier because over time, there were so many witnesses who were coming out who could tell us the stories. And they wanted to tell the stories because they were finally safe and angry about what had happened, because it was relentless. There would be sweeps of people. You were beaten from the moment you were arrested. And the terror of it was so palpable when you listen to these tales. It was just excruciating to listen to them. So that's what you're looking for in the field, the way to convey to the audience in short form. They're not there with you. I don't have a lot of words. I can't write a beautiful narrative. That's not my job. And so that's what I'm looking for, to be able to. You can't go back if you miss something. That's not how radio works. So it has to be completely linear. A, B, C, D, E, the end. And there's also that with your structure, because otherwise you'll lose people. But, you know, most of my career was spent in audio, and, you know, it's so instinctive and intuitive. I'm sure as a photographer, you feel the same way. You know it when you see it. I know it when I hear it. And your brain kind of latches onto things that you go, yes, 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 yes. That would be it.
So, Susan, do you have a thought about this?
Well, it's just so, I love hearing this, because what you may or may not know is how much I do audio alongside of photography.
Oh, no.
And sometimes it doesn't always get published in that form, but when I do exhibitions, very often I bring voices in. So you see photographs on the wall, but you hear the voices of the people that are in the photographs. So I'm trying to, there's a frozen moment, and as Julia said, I really like to think about that moment in time, framed in a particular way over time. And going back to those frames, finding the people in those frames, which I did more in Nicaragua, but even in El Salvador, trying to find the people in the photographs that I had that spoke to a certain moment of seeing violence, for example. It's only through audio that gets conveyed. So I could describe to you a photograph in which everyone is looking and mesmerized by a body that is being suspended. It goes back to public display, as you said, to terrorize anyone from participating. And you look at those faces and their eyes that are staring at, and then they're averting, and then they're both the soldiers and the civilians. And I went back to Salvador to try to find anyone who could tell me how much that image had stayed with them 25 years later. Because you can't imagine it not being a totally traumatic experience to be forced to look at a body that's been killed and dragged through a town, etc.
But I've always thought that the most powerful combination is a still photograph and audio. You know, audio is our first sense and our last sense. And that's why I think that people you can get them to pay attention to audio. And, you know, you could have a brass band march in front of you when you're watching TV and it's okay. But with audio, you have to pay attention because it works in your brain that way. So my guess is that you have learned over the years that that frozen in time moment with the audio is the most powerful combination that there can be.
So, Susan, I want to ask you a little bit more about Nicaragua. I mean, you're probably, certainly, maybe not your most iconic photographs, but among your many iconic photographs, the photographs that you made in Nicaragua during the revolution in 1979, it certainly expressed very comprehensively the moment, the uprising, the optimism. And if I'm not mistaken, your book is of Nicaraguan photographs is being released again. It just was released this year. So you know, that was a situation, and you've been going back to Nicaragua and considering thinking more about the people in those images. Where are they now? Now we're in a situation where independent journalists can't even operate. You know, one of the revolutionaries has taken over Nicaragua and turned it into a dictatorship so that an independent thinking journalist can't even operate in Nicaragua anymore. So how do you, so when you start to think about, all right, the truth of these photographs and the question of accountability, how do you see those photographs in relationship to the Ortega regime right now?
Well, you know, it's interesting because the word accountability feels very appropriate to the work in El Salvador. The work, I think for me, the work about Nicaragua is the work we all do with our own memory of what we thought, we imagined, we believed was possible at the time. So of course, I'm talking to the gray hairs in the room. Some of you were born in 1978, but maybe not all of you. So, you know, but that was a popular insurrection that was just phenomenal. There was a historian of Latin America anticipated that there would be the revolution post the Cuban Revolution of '59. Nobody imagined the possibility of a, you know, civilian society mobilizing itself, unifying in the ways that they did, and overthrowing the dictatorship of Somoza. So I certainly didn't know when I went that that's what was going to happen a year later. Again, the process is not looking at it as news, experiencing it as people making history. And, you know, I think about that right now, you know, May 1st, April 5th. I'm thinking about, are we making history? Or are we not going to be making history? Are we going to continue to be able to be out in the streets? I was watching people, be it Nicaragua, El Salvador, as mobilized as they could. The last mobilization I was able to be at in Nicaragua was 2018. And then it really shut down. And the nonprofit organizations, something like 1,500 of them were closed. The churches were, the priests were forced to leave. You know, there's a whole litany of things that the Ortega government put in play, which made it impossible now to go back. So what do I have? I have a book of photographs that stay the same as a kind of reference set for our memory and for the memory of those that are in the photographs or who have seen the photographs, be they in Nicaragua or be they others who have seen the work over time. And that, I think, first I went back and made pictures from Revolution where I look for the people that are in
That was a film,
frame.
a
That
documentary.
was a film,
Yeah.
a 90-minute film. We turned the pages.
Which, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely see this film.
It's kind of, you go through the book of images that you may or may not have seen in a magazine, and then you see the person in the photograph, you know, remembering what it was like to be at that moment in time. So it's 10 years later, and it's right on the cusp of the Sandinistas being voted out of power, actually. That book is the book that Julia is referring to, now has QR codes. And then with the QR code, I've taken the 90-minute film and made 2 to 3 minute clips that really relate to the people in the photographs. So I'm disrupting the pleasure of a book turning and pages frozen. It's not just an audio track, it's a visual clip of that person redefining themselves 10 years later, how they felt then, how they feel now. And and the next stage was the 25th anniversary, bringing actually the photographs as murals. And that was more about the population itself remembering what it had experienced. So the photographs trigger memories. So we don't do actually formal interviews, and I'm sure this is also how you work. You see someone passing and they look reflective, so you think, what are you thinking about? And then it unfolds. So it's a different approach, but I think similarly it's how do the photographs, what do they do over time? So
Yeah.
whether they're doing it in a court case, which I'm very happy with CJA, that every time you call, or Terry Carl calls insisting, I need that photograph, I need that book. You know, that's one thing, and that's very satisfying to have a small role in the enormity of what you all do in a daily way. And I go on more in that reflective space, you know. What does it mean that we've lived this history?
You know, we were talking about this earlier. For me, those photographs, your photographs, to look at them today. I mean, I know you have this, maybe, I don't know if it's ambivalence is the right, but you know, here was this heroic revolution. For me, it represents, it's an opportunity to really experience the profound betrayal of the Ortega regime, because these were ideals that inspired a generation of Latin Americans, inspired a generation of journalists. I mean, we really, you know, this was a US-backed dictator, and the people in this country rose up and threw the guy out and created with a whole new vision of how they were going to run the country. And to see it betrayed so terribly, it's you know, to me, that is the truth that you tell in that photographs is just so important for people to understand what needs to happen now. We cannot stay where we are with Nicaragua. There has to be a way forward. There has to be a way out with what's going on in Nicaragua right now. It's too much of a betrayal of a whole set of ideals of so many, you know, generations of people who've been concerned about Latin America. So thank you for your photographs.
Well, the photographs do always trigger that remembrance. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
Just that you also have to account for a history in between then. In those 10 years in a Contra war that was pretty severe.
I thought it was interesting what you just commented, which is, you know, I said, well, presumably Daniel Ortega's in a number of those photographs, and you said, well, actually, he wasn't fighting. He was not in, you know, he wasn't on the front line during the revolution.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's another thing you can find out, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, we have time for some questions, Carmen. Would this be a good time to take some questions? Any questions?
I can hand around a microphone while you all think about.
Come on, attorneys.
They're not all.
It's time for the cross-examination.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for coming and speaking with us. This was fascinating. And it's been really interesting hearing your stories. My dad actually was in El Salvador during that time and was good friends with those Maryknoll nuns, and really helped shape my life. He was going to be a Maryknoll priest, and then met my mom. So good for me. But, but I was wondering if
they kind of had that impact on people at the time.
Yeah. I was wondering, in light of developments that we're seeing in the way that people ingest the news, and when we see this rise in what we call misinformation, in particular, thinking about what was happening in El Salvador at that time, and misinformation, the use of it in that conflict, where sometimes you didn't know who was responsible for what act, what atrocious act. And if the two of you can kind of talk about how maybe your experience can shed some light in how we can approach misinformation today in terms of truth telling and getting to the heart of what's actually happening.
I don't think we have an answer yet. That's certainly been my experience. I was listening to a Zoom about, you know, there's tons of activists in Syria who spent the last 14 years trying to stay alive. And many of them went to Germany, and many of them, you know, worked on getting the prosecutions there done. And And one of the most interesting things that a researcher said was, I have no idea what's going on in Syria. The misinformation, the fake news is so profound that I can't see through the fog. I don't know what's happening. People take pictures from Gaza and say they happened in Syria. People take pictures of dead bodies from other places and say they happened in Syria. And this new government has no media strategy to counter that misinformation. So partly what happens is, there's a fury because people are getting killed, and it just gets worse. And I'm on a back channel with lots of journalists who are working on Syria now that the old regime is out. And everybody is very, somebody will say, we think an Israeli helicopter landed in Dara. And somebody else will say, don't put this here unless you know. Don't start it here. We're journalists. You want to talk about a fixer, I'm fine. But unless you have it verified, don't do it. So I think we're in trouble on this even today because people don't yet know how to counter it.
Susan?
Wow.
It's hard to make a photograph lie.
You
No,
know,
it's
well,
not.
I was just thinking about the
It
way
used to be.
I just blanked out on the film that Oliver Stone made about El Salvador. What's the name of it?
Salvador.
The Salvador film. And then he made there was a different film in
Oh.
Nicaragua, which I've just blanked on the name of. But the reason it's relevant is because the theme of that film, which I'm sorry, it's just escaped me, was that they kept the leader alive who was actually dead to keep the movement. And it was a fictional representation of the Nicaraguan Revolution, completely fictional in the sense there wasn't a single leader, there were 9 comandantes, etc. I've just blanked on it. It's Ed Harris is the star. That anybody
I
help?
can't remember. Yeah.
Anyway, the point of that is that how you manipulate, when I find a dead body on the side of the road, I don't know anything more than the fact that there's a dead body on the side of the road. So I'm not, I may be with a journalist and we try and investigate that, but that is a fact, right? What caused it, the conditions that led to it, a whole set of things, I don't have the means to pursue. So misinformation, to me, what's problematic is this, how would I say, what do you do with what you have as a maker? How do you contextualize it with others? And this goes back to, who you're working with. These are really important changes. Very rarely are photographers and writers working together anymore in the media. So when I think back on the strongest work I was able to do, it is with reporters. It's not assuming that the work I'm making is out of the context that they're also creating. And so now, what am I faced with? I'm a photographer. Yes, I can put on my pictures on Instagram and to whom and to whatever, and they can be altered easily. And we have AI coming, and Apple invented scissors a long time ago to cut up any picture and use it, whatever part of it. So I've been living with the inability to control images and the context and the social contract that I felt I had with people that are in my photographs for a very long time. I wouldn't call it misinformation. I would just say it's a whole process of the inability to contextualize sufficiently, and the attention that we all have. Part of what I think is difficult. We're talking about Syria, and you really know a lot. And most people are on their iPhones dancing between how many different places. And do they know where Syria is, where Sudan is, what's happening in the Congo? We could go a long list. That's if you're oriented towards that, which we are all trained intuitively to see these interconnections. I think most Americans haven't been there and don't want to go there. And they think they've been there by scrolling through their iPhones half the time. They don't need to know more. They sort of did it,
Let me say one more thing, and partly because I worked in Syria, and this is kind of the birth of open source investigations. It's where Bellingcat comes from. And there is a generation of people who are using open source to investigate war crimes. And, their methods are satellite imagery, geo tagging videos, social media posts. And because they're not exactly journalists, although they behave like them, they feel a responsibility to tell you exactly how they did it. We don't do that. But because we're mainstream media and we don't have to. But they, for their own credibility, feel like they have to turn the knitting upside down. I got this from a satellite. I tracked this. And I think the rise of that is a very interesting phenomenon because it's parallel to journalism, and now it's mixing with journalism. The New York Times has a whole visual unit that is all filled with ex-Bellingcat people. The Washington Post has them. The BBC has something called Africa Eye, meaning Africa Investigations. They are expanding that. It's all done with open source investigations. And I think in part, it's an answer. It's not the whole answer, but it is one small answer to this problem with mis and disinformation. Because nobody that does that explains how they got there. That's the whole point, is to fool you. But these people, they can tell you exactly how they got it.
Question?
Really good point.
Yes. Oh,
One here, then we'll.
Oh, okay.
you're watching the questions? There we go.
Hi
Yeah.
there. Thank you so much. I was really struck by something that you said, Ms. Amos, right up front, about how in Syria after the revolution, the government's actions became so much more visible. And I feel like I have been having similar thoughts recently about kind of the cruelty being the point of some of the things that I've seen happening here in the US. You both have really unique perspectives because you've been witnesses to so many different revolutions, conflicts across different cultures. And I was curious if you have noted any patterns in both the red flags as a conflict worsens and things that you've seen happen over and over, that maybe we should keep an eye out for ourselves, as well as green flags and strategies that you saw being particularly successful in countering these bad things that you've seen happen over and over.
So I was in Washington a couple of months ago, and it was a talk by somebody from the dearly departed USAID. And she said, wars aren't fought anymore to win. They are fought to punish. And that, I had to really think about that. And that certainly is what happened in Syria. It is what's happening in Ukraine. It is what's happening with Israel, Gaza. Nobody wants to win. They just want to keep going to punish. And her point as a USAID person is, it is so straining us to deliver humanitarian aid because it never stops. And the people who are at risk, that population just grows and grows. So I haven't completely digested this idea, but I had to think about how often that's exactly how I would explain what I was looking at. And, in the case of Syria, what happened is eventually you collapse. That's why Bashar was done, because the whole edifice collapsed. And that's why Syrians accepted an ex-jihadi to be their guy, because their reasoning was, it couldn't be worse. We're tired. We can't do this anymore. And it couldn't be worse. I don't know about green flags. I suppose, and I see this in all the wars I'm talking about, and that is the rise of civil society. They actually have power to investigate war crimes, to push for prosecutions. And I sometimes think that it is the triumph of hope over experience. When people take pictures in war zones because they think that somebody will do something with them, I think, really? And where have you seen that? But they continue to do it. They upload it. They take risks to get the picture. It's just extraordinary how much that represents hope. I mean, and that's a challenge to you in what you do and us in what we do, that people still think that somebody will do something. against all the evidence.
Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation and for all the important work you've done. The current administration has obviously launched numerous attacks on the press, particularly on federally funded media, taking steps to defund NPR and PBS. And I was recently looking at that executive order, and I was interested to see the stated rationale, which was part of the rationale was, unlike in the 60s when the Public Broadcasting Corporation was founded, the media landscape is filled with now different options and different viewpoints. And the executive order says, I quote, that the concept of government-funded news media is, quote, not only outdated and unnecessary, but corrosive to the appearance of journalistic independence. I was wondering how you would respond to that. And do you think there is still an important role for federally funded media? And what does it bring to the table that's different from private corporations?
I'll give you a quick comment about public radio. Thank you, Viktor Orban. That's the roadmap. It's the language, and that's how he did it. There's another thing in the executive order, and it's about, and this is what Orban did. You're having commercials, and you're not supposed to, so you're breaking the law. And I have a friend at Princeton who is a absolute expert on Orban and how he created an illiberal democracy. And she said, it's him. They've taken it straight out of his toolbox. You have anything to add?
Well, no, because you're Miss NPR. You're my guiding star, you know? No, because I don't work within that kind of yeah, and I think the trouble that people in the world that I'm in, and I just last night was celebrating with really the next gen, as it were, the generation that just won a whole lot of Pulitzer Prizes. And we were celebrating together with the New York Times, some from the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. And they still have something that's viable. That's, that they still go out and make work, and the New Yorker, make work believing that it will be somewhere, right? And it will be seen, it will be thought about, but what impact it will have is where they get, there's, let's say the larger community that doesn't have those opportunities. It's not only about federal funding, it's the whole breakdown.
Yes, it's the
of
breakdown.
the media.
I mean, Deb since she's recently retired from NPR and still very much in that universe, she's not, she's practicing nonpartisan, non-political journalism, but I'm not. And I will tell you that
She announced.
we need public radio. Yes, absolutely. Why? Because the annihilation of local journalism across the country is part of the reason why we're in the political situation that we're in today. And for better or worse, the journalists who work for public radio are journalists who want to get to the facts. They are fact-finding journalists. And in many communities across the country where, especially public radio stations are listener supported, they're supported by the local community. This is the only source of independent information that folks will get. The alternative is whatever's coming, whatever, stream of I don't know what to call it, stream of undifferentiated information that's coming in through your mobile phone. And so, yes, we need public radio. This is, the idea that the Trump administration is attacking public radio because they're in favor of independent journalism is absurd on its face. I'm sorry. And so the answer is yes, please support public radio.
Let me say one more thing about how that worked. So the business model of NPR is that federal money, it's about 15% of the entire budget, doesn't come to NPR. It goes to radio stations, and almost all of them are minority stations of one kind or another. And the reason that they need that support is because they don't yet have a listener base. Now, they pay National Public Radio for the news package. You get Morning Edition, you get All Things Considered, you get Terry Gross, you get the whole thing in a package. And that's how you pay for it with those federal funds. So what they're doing, and that's all they'll take. It's 15%. That's all it is. And it's not even out of NPR's budget. It's not. NPR headquarters does not take federal money. But those stations, if they lose that money, they will close. And those are minority stations, all of them. That's who gets that money. That's what we're going to lose. And that's tragedy. NPR will survive this. PBS is taking more federal money than NPR ever did. They're in more trouble than NPR. But I think it's a tragedy that, NPR was always in its infancy and through its middle age was a very, very white network. That was the critique of us for years. And finally, we were getting there where it was broader and all kinds of people were listening, and to have it die now would be a terrible thing.
Another question?
That was one of the gray-haired people in the room, just to give a little context. I was in Nicaragua during the Contra War in '84, and I did organizing work, bringing folks from the U.S. into El Salvador in '88 and in '89 during the Civil War. So your book on Nicaragua and El Salvador hold a very special place in my bookcase, and I think particularly El Salvador because having been there during the war, like you said, you see people changing history, and your book really documents the terror. Such a visual, beautiful, as horrible as the images were, but just really so concise and to the point. So thank you for that. And I lived in DC, so Julia, I've read all your articles, and I worship Ray Bonner, the journalist. So anyway, it's a very important, very I feel honored to be here. It's been exciting. So my question is, what keeps, what drives you? Like after all these years and seeing the rise and fall and things we believed in and fought for, and what keeps you going? And I think that's something to be really helpful in what we're dealing with right now in our country.
Keeps you going.
Well, sometimes I think I'm going backwards, and sometimes I'm going forwards. And part of going backwards is very important. I mean, I was thrown when Julia asked this question because 45 years ago is a really long time to really have get back into the skin and this question of what drives you forward is a lot about memory and what you can contribute to memory and to communities that are rebuilding to the next generation. That's really important to me, with a set of values. I mean, Julia spoke about the values we carried, which we were responding to possibilities. We weren't part of, we weren't the people making that history, but our work contributed to others believing in possibilities also. So that was a very powerful interaction, let's say. I mean, I referred to May 1st, I am haunted by what has happened to many protests that I've photographed over the years in many places. So I really hope we can stay on the streets, even though I know the streets are not the courts, and I know the courts are slow and the streets are impatient and all of that. But it gives me a kind of collective sense of what we need to still do and believe in. So that's another aspect. But the moral compass is also very, what's the word exactly? Every day that I read about back to this iPhone scroll and know that we have done nothing about places that we all know and can name is just devastating. I mean, I think this even goes back to what it felt like in the period that we were mobilized. We believed that people seeing and learning and listening and were moving us somewhere collectively. And so I find it really difficult that what the protests speak to our souls, we feel better, but I'm not sure what can be done. And that classic question is still there, haunting me, really, because I want to know, but I don't feel my knowing more is doing enough.
Deb, what keeps you going?
Same thing, I think. You get this, I mean, and it's this, that's why you're doing what you're doing. It's this quest for accountability. I mean, when you watch over so many years, people bomb hospitals, they bomb bread lines, they bomb children, they target journalists, and the world says, oh,
Yeah.
And at some moment, it makes you mad. And mad, both kinds. Because you cannot believe that this is possible. And because you're so close to it, you know the people who have been affected by it, who've lost family. It's very hard for me to watch, photographs of Gaza, to see whole families wiped out in a wink. I don't understand how those people are not, just running into the sea. And so there's a moment where you think, if I keep doing this, if I switch a bit towards accountability, then maybe one of these people will finally go to jail or be annoyed by their inability to go to Rome on vacation because there's an arrest warrant for them. I mean, I find that I've switched my attention, which is how I came to do the trial for Marie Colvin. I've really switched my attention to accountability. That's really all I care about now. And that's what I cover. That's what I research. That's what I want to see, that somebody pays a price. Because if nobody pays a price, it's going to get worse. If armies can do anything, they'll do everything. And because they know they can get away with it. And they are getting away with it in conflicts that are very close to us. So I think that is what drives me. I just want somebody to pay.